Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Atlanta Press Club. Our newsmaker today is with Georgia's Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger. My name is Christy Wooten. I'm the current president of the Atlanta Press Club. Thank you to our annual sponsors, and thank you to you, our board of directors, members, supporters, and all who are joining us this morning. If you have questions for our panelists today, please go ahead and type those into the Q&A or chat functions at the bottom of your Zoom window. And then you can visit atlantapressclub.org to learn more about our upcoming events, sponsor future events, or donate to the club. We are pleased today to have Secretary of State Raffensperger with us to talk about all things voters and voting in Georgia, disinformation, his book, Integrity Counts, and other topics. For those of us joining us from other states, Secretary Raffensperger was in the eye of the storm after the 2020 US presidential election when former President Trump refused to accept Georgia's election results. The secretary has remained very busy since then, and you may have even seen him on TV recently, including 60 Minutes, CNN, and The Takeout. Welcome, Secretary Raffensperger. Today good morning. We're also lucky to have two journalists with us today who have covered Georgia politics and government for broadcast, print, and digital. Please welcome our co-moderators, Nicole Carr from ProPublica, and Mark Niesse from he's the Georgia government reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Welcome both of you and the secretary. We are going to jump right in today and get started with questions. And again, audience members, if you do have questions for the secretary, please put those in the chat or Q&A function. Thanks everybody, and we'll get started.
Good morning, everyone, and good morning, Secretary Raffensperger. Thank you for joining us. I'll kick the questions off this morning, and we're going to start really broad with something that's been in the news recently. January 6th, and we know even from a passage in your book and from reporting on the ground that day, January 6th was the day that you were escorted from the Capitol amid a Stop the Steal rally on the Capitol grounds. A former Klan leader had entered the Capitol looking for you that day, and you didn't realize that there was an attack on the US Capitol until you'd returned home and turned on the TV and saw everything that we witnessed that day. This month, the Republican Party has characterized some of the folks engaging in legitimate political discourse, their words in an official statement about January 6th. We have since then seen high-ranking members of the party, including Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, reject that definition of January 6th. So I'd like to know what you make of the divide in the messaging on January 6th within the party and where you stand on that definition.
Good morning. Well, where I stand is I always back the blue. I have two nephews. I have a brother-in-law that have been in law enforcement. That's their career. And I'm always going to support law enforcement. What we're seeing right now, we always need to be respectful and mindful that law enforcement has a tough job. And so I'm always going to support the police. And what happened, attack on police officers at the Capitol, is horrendous. In fact, a young lady that went to a Christian high school here in Georgia, graduated from UGA, and then she joined the Capitol Police. And she was one of the first people that was attacked by the mob and ended up with a concussion. And so we gave her an award for being an outstanding Georgia citizen. I'm always going to stand with law enforcement.
What do you make of the divide of the messaging within the party at this point?
Well, we're going through a process right now, and at the end of the day, we'll come out stronger, better, and unified. But we do need a positive, uplifting message, and I think people are looking for principled, conservative leadership up and down the ballot. I think I've shown that I'll stand and take the slings and arrows, and I'll fight hard to make sure we have honest and fair elections in Georgia. And that's my job, to follow the Constitution, follow the law.
Great, Mr. Secretary, great to see you. Thank you again for joining us. It's always good to talk with you and hear from you because, elections are so important. Along the same lines of what Nicole was talking about, you've testified before the January 6th committee, and the AJC has reported on that, everything involving the fallout from the 2020 election, including Trump's call. I know you've talked about this many times, and it's you've been over it again and again, including in your book, Integrity Counts. And I was just wondering, over this last year, have your perceptions changed? And how did you perceive that phone call? Did you feel like it was threatening or coercive?
Well, I understand that obviously President Trump, for some reason, I think it was because his people fed him information. And that's why January 6th, I was writing a letter with my general counsel. It's a 10-page letter. And Congress has had that letter now since January 6th, 2021. And they have never sent me any notification, and they never disputed a single point in there. And it was a point by point, refuting of every single allegation that was made. Like, for example, they said there was 10,315 dead people, and all we've ever found was 4. There weren't 66,000 underage voters. There was actually 0. There weren't thousands of felons. There's less than 74, things like that. But every allegation that was made is in that letter. I wrote a book to set the record straight. I'm continuing to set the record straight, because here's what happened, Mark. In fall of 2020, 28,000 Georgians skipped the presidential ballot, and yet they voted down ballot. In the Republican congressional areas, our Republican congressman got 33,000 more votes than President Trump. That's what happened in Georgia, plain and simple.
And you talked all about a lot of the checks and investigations that your office has done since then. And now in this 2022 legislative session, there's discussion about having more GBI involvement in elections. We have a proposal. The Speaker of the House, David Ralston, wants to empower the GBI to intervene in election investigations, and similar proposal by former Senator David Perdue, who is now running for governor, calling for a law enforcement election policing branch. And I wanted to hear more about this idea and what you think about it, because the GBI already helped the Secretary of State's office with many election investigations dealing with absentee ballot signatures, ballot harvesting allegations, allegations of counterfeit ballots. And with the GBI's assistance and your own office investigators, those claims were shown not to be true. So what do you think about granting the GBI more authority to investigate in elections? And do you think it's not necessary?
Well, the fact is, what we really need is a fully funded elections division and a fully funded investigation division. Right now, we have 22 post-certified officers and inspectors that are part of the Secretary of State's office, but only 2 of those are actually assigned to elections. So during election year, what we do is the other 20 folks are then focused primarily on the election process, looking at infractions, violations, allegations, things like that. But normally then that pulls people off of looking at nursing, engineering, and all the other trades and occupations that we have, and that gets backed up. So if we had a fully funded investigation division, that would really allow us to get these results back quicker. But as we've shown, we'll reach out to other law enforcement agents. When we had that myth about the State Farm Arena, about ballot stuffing and illegality, we reached out to both the GBI and the FBI. And at the end of the day, all 3 of our organizations, ours and those other organizations, said that nothing happened there, interviewed all the people, and watched the full run of tape. And then President Trump's handpicked successor for the U.S. Attorney, the Northern District, Bobby Christine, came up here, and he was quoted in the AJC saying, "I thought there'd be something there," and he dismissed that case quite shortly. So we've shown that we will work with law enforcement agencies, and we'll continue to do that to make sure that we can get to the bottom of the truth on every single allegation that's made.
So to be clear, is that support or oppose a proposal to have GBI more jurisdiction to do election investigations in Georgia?
I believe that the Secretary of State's office should be fully funded.
So you need more investigators.
I believe that when you have 2 specifically assigned for elections, and then you in effect redirect your people that are assigned to other occupations and trades, that it really puts a burden on that. And obviously what people want is they want answers quickly. We've had nearly 300 cases. We've about 40 to 50 left to come before the State Election Board. We've cleaned up all the backlog since I've been Secretary of State. We've done yeoman's work to get this thing done. But like I said, we will investigate, and we'll reach out to law enforcement agencies if they can help us with, like we had it for the signature match study that we did, the audit we did in Cobb County. That obviously that was we had to reach out to GBI, and we got that done in short order, and we proved that signature match was performed.
Is that sustainable without more security? I know we'll move on to other questions, but I mean, without more law enforcement involved to continue to go back to these agencies and outside of the office?
Well, from a historical perspective, yes, it would be. But if you look at what happened in 2018, Stacey Abrams had her stolen election, myth, which was that she was voter suppression. In fact, back in October, she said, just because you win doesn't mean you won. That was just what, 2-3 months ago. And so we eventually, had up to 15 lawsuits from Stacey Abrams and all of her liberal allied groups. We were, spending an awful lot of time with, our investigators on that. And then roll it forward to 2020 was voter fraud. Neither one of them are supported by facts. But if we have candidates that are running with these stolen election claims, yes, whoever it is going to be busy, knocking these things down. Because at the end of the day, what we've shown in Georgia, it's easy to vote, it's hard to cheat. We have the appropriate guardrails to make sure we can identify who these voters are, and we investigate and we prosecute all violators.
Muted there. That'll bring us to SB 202, and we want to walk through how voting will be different in 2022 versus 2020 because of the legislation. Can you walk us through what you believe are the highlights of that legislation and how it will change?
Well, when I ran back in 2018, I said we need to make sure that only American citizens vote in our elections. We need a verifiable paper ballot trail, which we got. And that came in handy because we could do 100% hand recounts. And then also said we need to be able to join the electronic registration information center so we could update our voter rolls objectively. We got that also. And I said we needed to ban ballot harvesting. We got that. But the one thing we didn't get is photo ID for absentee voting. I wanted to have photo ID for all forms of voting, and we finally got that. And SB 202 now will have photo ID with driver's license number, and that's going to improve the security of that and also voter confidence because so many allegations were made about the signature match. Was that subjective? Was it done? Things like that. Well, now it's photo ID based. That's good. We also are holding counties accountable. During the November election, the average wait time was 2 minutes in the afternoon of Tuesday election day. And the longest I saw on the leaderboard was about 50 minutes. And that's great progress. We want to make sure the counties continue that, keep lines short than 1 hour. We're going to use security paper for all ballots. That's a good thing. That helps shore up security and confidence. And then also we now have accountability. If a county can't seem to run an election, and we have one county that's been failing since 1993, because we did our research. We saw the articles in the AJC going all the way back to 1993, which is nearly 30 years ago. Now there's accountability. And there's a review panel looking at Fulton County right now. And so they can improve. And if they don't improve, their board can be replaced and they'll then have a new election director put in place. So accountability is a good thing. And so those are some of the good measures that are put in place that I think that will shore up confidence, but also shore up the accuracy of what we're trying to do. Keeping the third-party groups from flooding voters with absentee ballot applications. But what was happening is that voters were filling out 2, 3, or 4 of those, sending them to the county office, not understanding that it is a problem for the county election official. They're bogged down on paperwork. And so now if you want to vote absentee, request your ballot, and you have to get it in 11 days before so that the county can process it, they can mail you your ballot, and then you can mail it back in or drop it off at a drop box. Drop boxes have been put into state law for the very first time. And we've actually increased early voting up to 19 days for any county that wants to have 2 additional Sunday voting. 19 days versus President Biden's home state of Delaware has 10 days. We have kept no excuse absentee voting. And in Delaware, you need a doctor's permission slip to vote absentee. So it's like I said, it's easy to vote in Georgia. We have record registrations, record turnout. And yet, we've somehow, been picked on by President Biden. But, we're big people. We can fight back and we can push back when President Biden says things that just aren't supported by the facts.
And certainly critics of SB 202 have said it would create barriers or hinder voters from going to the polls. Do you think there will be any impact on voters? Because there are a few extra steps, especially on absentee voting, limitations on drop boxes, voter ID. Do you think that will have any effect that would prevent any voters or make it a little bit more difficult for any voters to cast their ballots?
No, because photo ID has been used for over 10 years here in Georgia for in-person voting. People said it was going to hurt voters. Hasn't happened at all. In fact, now there's peer-reviewed studies showing it has not decreased turnout. When we go with photo ID with driver's license for absentee voting, they've been using that in Minnesota for now 11 years, I believe. And so they've been using it in a blue state. We're using it here in Georgia. Texas is going to use the same model we're using, driver's license. And that shores up confidence. And then if you look at, we now have 17 days mandatory of early voting. That's more than most northern states. So if you want to really improve voting in America, you need to look at some of these northern states, not Georgia.
I want to ask a question about the political climate as it relates to county elections boards who run the elections. Is there concern that because of the climate, of the rhetoric, and of threats that election workers faced in this last cycle, similar to the ones that you faced in your office, that there will be people willing to serve and that the resources will be in place for them to run smooth elections? Because at the end of the day, that's what it boils down to, who's working them in the counties. How do you?
Well, I'm not concerned about the poll workers. First of all, they take an oath to follow the law and to do their work. They also go through poll worker training. And those are really skilled professionals that are volunteering. They may get $120 to $150 a day as they're working it, but those are your citizens. Those are the people you meet at the grocery store. You see them at Rotary, Kiwanis, at your church groups, out there at the ball field. Those are good citizens working hard to do the job. One thing that we did find during the election of 2020 is a lot of the people that were third party or political party observers didn't understand, the poll monitors didn't understand some of the rules. So now we have available poll worker training for them so they can understand what process they're going through. So they really have that skill base, that knowledge base, say, oh, I see what they're doing right there. So we do check, and double check to make sure that we're following the process and making sure all the numbers line up. And I think that'll help instill confidence in all the monitors as they're watching that process. We also have encouraged the counties to make sure it's a transparent process. And I visited several county election offices recently, and they're adding additional windows and things like that so people can actually observe the process. And I think that's really helpful to dispel any of that conspiracy theory stuff that happens all the time. When you have transparency, then that really, I think, helps everyone have confidence in what's going on.
We had a lot of that in the last election, and it still resulted in those types of threats and just a really tough environment in those polling places where we were reporting. Do you think people are still willing to serve in that capacity?
Well, I think you could make a case that by and large, the level of civil discourse in America in all areas has not been the high level that our parents or our grandparents raised us to be. And so I think we really need to elevate our standard of acting and interfacing with other human beings. I think that's really important. But also we can still be principled in our values. I'm a principled conservative, but we can have honest discussions. But number one, we want to make sure everyone's following the law and following the Constitution, that everyone has the opportunity to vote that wants to do so.
Okay, great. That's a lot about the election law passed last year, Senate Bill 202, but there are a lot of ongoing proposals. Election legislation never stops at the Capitol because there's always room for changes and possibly improvements or not laws that aren't necessarily improvements. And so I wanted to hear your thoughts about some of the ideas that legislators have proposed here in the Capitol. One proposal to ban drop boxes entirely. They are currently allowed under SB 202, but only in in-person early voting locations. There's also some legislators want more election audits. And then there's also a bill that would make ballots a matter of public record. I'm really curious what you think about those ideas.
Well, number one, banning the absentee ballot drop boxes. Right now, they're inside an election office under the physical observance of an election worker. I think that's much more secure than someone just driving by the post office, and it won't be under any kind of video surveillance, anything like that. So you don't know what's happening at the post office. Plus, we know that although that's not a state responsibility, federal government doesn't know how to run the post office and hadn't run it well for how many years now. We always moan and groan about the post office. So this is a secure way of doing that. It's under the observation of a poll worker. And that was put into place last year with the General Assembly. And I think we need to work through one election cycle, see how it works. But like I said, I've been visiting election offices. I've heard what their process is. And there will be election workers that are actually watching who's dropping these things off. And when people know that, I think that really helps us, instill confidence in the process.
Another question about the former president and his influence on the elections and the candidates this year in Georgia. We clearly see that effects in endorsements, in the way that the campaigns are running in these major races. Do you believe former President Trump's support is necessary for Republicans to secure office here? And would you seek his support?
Well, I won't be having his support because he's already supported Congressman Jody Heiss. And the challenge that Congressman Heiss is going to have is that he said that all the people that used the machines for his election, those were all valid votes and they got it right. But somehow, when he got to Congress to certify the presidential race, he said something happened with the presidential race. And that's a double-minded person. And that's a person that, as a pastor, he should realize that's a challenging position to be. But also as a pastor, he's held to a higher standard anyway, and he's not holding that high standard. He talks about, states' responsibilities and state sovereignty, and yet he's up there in Washington, D.C., trying to overturn the will of Georgian people. And what happened in Georgia is that 28,000 Georgians skipped the presidential ballot and yet voted down ballot. And the Republican congressman got 33,000 more votes than President Trump. If anything, Congressman Heiss should have been out campaigning for President Trump instead of just looking out for himself. Awfully selfish, I would say. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, I won't share my thoughts on that, but I do wonder if he had not endorsed Heiss, would you have sought his support?
I'm running on my own merits. I've shown that I'll stand and I'll fight hard to make sure that we can update our voting system with the new verifiable paper ballot, which allows us to do 100% hand recount. So when we did that 100% hand recount, we verified two things. One is that the original scanned ballot count was accurate, and also that the machines did not flip the votes. We pulled out all 5 million paper ballots, put them on the table, stacks of 3. Who voted for President Trump? Who voted for Vice President Biden? Who voted for Joe Jorgensen? We added that all up. The numbers were virtually the same. And so we proved that the machines did not flip the votes. We now did 100% risk limiting. And then Joseph Kirk, one of our election directors in Bartow County, has done additional races, just to really help instill confidence. And we'll be looking at rolling out additional risk limiting audits for other races in the 2022 cycle.
Good. With the campaign and with so many candidates running for Secretary of State and challenging you, especially within your own party, I wonder how difficult that is. What is your path to victory? How do you campaign? How do you convince voters, especially Republican voters, that you're the right candidate and not your opponents?
Because I've shown that I follow the law. I believe that our Constitution was given to us as God inspired. And so we have a higher authority, and I believe it's God. And then we have our Constitution. We don't have a king. If you want a king, you go over to England. You get a king all you want. You go to other places. But we don't have kings. What we have is Constitution. And so I follow the law, and I follow the Constitution. I back the blue. But also, I think what people are looking for is principled conservatives, not people with just hollow rhetoric and that just flame emotions, but actually get the job done. So we have a new verifiable paper ballot. We do risk limiting audits. We've updated the voter rolls. We're updating our voter registration database. We're continuing to seek improvements and making improvements in this office. We banned ballot harvesting. We've investigated, hundreds and hundreds of cases, and we brought people before, that have double voted or voted in 2 states, things like that. And so I've shown that I'm going to make sure that we have good, honest, fair elections. But if 28,000 people decide they're not going to vote for anyone for president, that's not my problem. That's the problem of the campaigns. And so my job is to make sure we do have fair and honest counts.
Great. You mentioned ballot harvesting, which, as you said, is illegal in Georgia and has been at least since 2019, when it was made illegal for anybody but a voter or a close family member in most cases to touch or handle or deliver an absentee ballot. I've also briefly reported, and we've seen it more in some conservative media, about this allegation that there was some sort of ballot harvesting operation in the 2020 election, and your office has opened an investigation into those claims. What can you tell us about that? Is there anything to this idea that people were being paid to deliver absentee ballots to drop boxes around Atlanta? I haven't seen any evidence of this whatsoever, but I have heard the allegation, and I was wondering if there's anything to it from what you've seen and heard so far.
That's what we've heard also. So we opened up an investigation. We saw little snippets, but we have not seen the entire data file that they have, or this person, this John Doe, that says that he was paid. And that requires us to get a subpoena from the state election board. Unfortunately, they had 2 new members. They haven't reconvened and elected an acting chairman yet, but as soon as they do, that's one of our first requests. So we get a subpoena so we can go ahead and find out who is this person, was he paid, how much was he paid, and who paid him. And we'll follow the money trail and we'll find out what truth is there. Like I said, we are going to make sure that we do a thorough deep dive investigation of everything, but we're waiting to be able to file a subpoena with the state election board. They have to choose their chairman first, and that's where we are right now.
Does it seem a little bit suspicious or flimsy to you that supposedly somebody was paid for ballots, but nobody will say who it was?
That's why we do investigations.
Before we move on to the audience questions, and when I was turning away, I was flipping through the book. I thought I'd mark this, but there's a chapter that you open up when you talk about a former longtime Georgia Secretary of State and his integrity and the legacy that he left behind. So I want to talk about your legacy. What do you believe that will be in the near future, and as history books look back on this time decades from now?
That I was an honest person and I walked by integrity and I did what was right. And every morning I could look in the mirror and look at myself, but even more important, I could look at my wife, Tricia, look at our kids, grandkids, and know that I did what was right. And that's good enough. Because eventually we're all going to be held accountable, either in this life or the next life that comes after it. And so that's what is really important to me. I'm a business person. I've been out in the business world. I shared in the book a little bit about Tricia and I meeting in high school. We got married halfway when I was through engineering school. Most people don't do stuff like that, but it's worked out just great for us. We raised a family. We lost a son. And so we've had tragedy in our family. We've also had business setbacks. But I've always wanted to lean into our faith and lean into Tricia, because as it says, a triple cord is soon not broken. So with the Lord and Tricia by my side, walking with faith, walking with integrity, that works for me.
Great, great. You and your office and Georgia voters have been through so much since 2022, and we've talked a lot about changes in laws and investigations. But what do you think we should look out for in this election year? What do you think will be the biggest concerns around voting integrity and election accuracy and voter access as we have primaries and general elections for governor, U.S. Senate, Congress, the Georgia legislature, Secretary of State, so many important races? What do you think are the biggest priorities and issues in your mind for this election year?
Well, I want to make sure that our election directors get out in their local counties and explain SB 202, really specifically the 11-day cutoff for absentee voting. So voters understand you have to get that in 11 days before election day. That's really important. And then we want also poll worker training for all the monitors that are going to be there with both political parties, third-party groups, so they understand what the process is. And then we also want to do additional audits. So then when there's a question, there is that close race, be it a state representative, county commission race, whatever it possibly could be, in 2022, it could be a U.S. Senate seat. We don't know what it'll be, but that we do a risk limit audit to verify the results. So everyone at the end of the day, like I said, back in January 2020, as we were rolling out these new machines, I understand in these polarized times that half the people are going to be happy, half the people are going to be sad, but we want 100% people to have confidence. We've been pushing back on these stolen election claims since Stacey Abrams. We had it in 2018, we had them in 2020, and we want to give people the confidence that yes, your person won fair and square, or yes, your person lost fair and square. And if they lost fair and square, then come back in a couple of years and try again.
Great. You mentioned audits, and I find it to be a fascinating topic because we should want our elections to be accurate and audited and checked and verified, but sometimes we've seen audits weaponized as a way to undermine confidence in elections. And in Georgia, audits are pretty new. Risk limiting audits anyway are pretty new. And we do one general election race. That's what the law calls for. Do you see a need to do more audits or different kinds of audits or more thorough canvassing to make sure that the number of voters matches the number of ballots cast? What do you see as room for improvement in auditing elections?
Oh, those are all good processes. Like how many people showed up to vote? How many people did you check in at the poll pod? How many at the BMD, the ballot marking device? How many people then scan the ballot, and then how many actual paper ballots do you have? Do they all line up? Well, if you have 100,000 ballots and you lose one or two, okay, but let's make sure it's really, really that tight of a system so that we find out that there's no leakages. Because when you have a state that is 70-30 for one party or another, if you have leakages, errors in the system, it doesn't matter quite so significantly. But when you get down to a race that it is a 49.9, 50.1 type race, every single vote matters. So every single thing to make sure, and that's why we've done a 100% citizenship check of the entire voter rolls. That's the first time that's ever been done in the state of Georgia, and I did that. And that's why we want to make sure we review any potential allegations of ballot harvesting. We need to make sure that with photo ID for the absentee voting process, we need to make sure that our voter rolls are clean, accurate, and up to date. And so we really have to make sure it's very, very tight and accurate, because the differences in some races are going to be so close. We've had state house seats that have been within 6 to 8 votes, and that's how close it can be sometimes.
Right. So the follow-up is, how do we get there? How do we make it more tight and accurate? Because you do see more variances than one or two, not huge, not swinging an election, but you do see, especially in larger counties with more voters, that sometimes the numbers might be off by 10 or 50 or something like that. It isn't airtight. How do we improve those processes?
Well, it gets on training, and then coming back and doing audits of everything and reviewing your results to see, did you look at everything? Did you catch everything? And then improve that process. And that's what the county election officers are doing right now in all their offices.
Secretary, we've talked a lot about transparency and the things that are to come, and where we've been since the last election. What happens when facts don't matter to people? When you're as transparent as possible, and you count and you recount and you audit and you re-audit and you examine laws and you change laws and you shape everything up, and the facts don't matter to people who believe one thing or the other, where does that put us? Do you have confidence that we come out of this space?
Well, facts matter to us. Facts matter to me. I'm an engineer, so facts matter a lot. Numbers are really important, particularly in this office. But that's why I wrote a 10-page letter to Congress. They've had it for over a year. No one has still responded to it, disputing any of the allegation. I wrote a book to set the record straight. It's out there also. I haven't gotten any letters from people, hey, I read your book and you're wrong on this point, this point. No, because people don't want to face the cold, hard, brutal fact. Why did 28,000 people skip the presidential ballot? Why did 33,000 people prefer to vote for their congressman than other people that were on the ballot? So things like that, those are just facts, and facts are a stubborn thing. At the end of the day, we have to learn that's what it was. But I think that as a Republican, as a conservative, I think when you have a positive, uplifting, aspirational message, and you have within you a spirit of joy, we have to start having some fun. I know that these are really important issues, but boy, when you're weaned on the pickle and all you ever do is whine and complain, that doesn't attract a lot of people to your cause. So have some fun, enjoy this. I believe that Republicans have the best message. We really do. We're talking about financial empowerment of everyone. We're talking about everyone has the opportunity to live the American dream. We're talking about we want a great educational system. We want America to be the very best it can be. We want Americans to enjoy the life that they really are hoping for. And so when we lean into that with principled integrity and leadership, I think then we'll do just fine. And people, at the end of the day, I think when they go home, yes, they're disappointed, but they probably know at the end of the day that this office did what we needed to do. And it's just a tough, bitter pill to swallow. And I understand many of my party are still, grieving over it. And that's why I try and be very gentle. I am very factual, but I need to help them understand that the 28,000 people skipped the presidential ballot, but we checked out all your allegations. There weren't thousands of dead people. There were 4. Those are the type of things, because facts do matter.
They do, but we still saw, with all that transparency and laying out the facts, we still saw an insurrection. We saw people who weren't willing to take that and go.
And people still want to believe Stacey Abrams' myth of voter suppression. And yet we had record registration, record turnout in the 2018 cycle. because
we hadn't gotten to violence yet, with all due respect. I mean, we're in a different place in this country right now. So are you hopeful that we overcome that?
Well, I think we are, because what we've shown, like in Georgia, we actually increased the number of days of early voting. Yes, last year when the General Assembly was working on these potential bills, at the end of the day, what they came through was good legislation, because it has photo ID, additional day of early voting, and now it's all 159 counties. We're going to have security paper. We're going to have drop boxes that are put into state law for the very first time. Line shorter than 1 hour, or else next time you got to bust your precinct in half or add equipment. Counties that, if they can't get it right, will be held accountable. So a lot of good measures in SB 202. But the essence of it is, it's never been easier to vote, but we have the appropriate guardrails that makes it very difficult to cheat and game the system.
Hi, everybody. We've got some great questions coming in. So I just wanted to jump in and start asking some of these questions that are coming in from the audience. So along the lines of what Nicole was saying, one of our board members, Maria Saporta, has a question. How hard is it to be a Republican in Georgia when there's still the contingent that continues to say, stop the steal? I think that the messaging there is probably difficult to deal with.
Well, there's lots of us out there that are principled conservatives, and this is our home. And trust me, there'll be a lot of them, and a lot of them will come out to vote. Our party's diverse. We have a diverse group of opinions, just like the Democrat Party. And so I know that there's many Democrats that are close to the center of the line, and they're not real big fans of AOC. And so, it is what it is. But at the end of the day, what people do want is they want government to work for them. And so if you look at what we've done in the Office of Secretary of State, you now can renew your corporation for up to 3 years. If you are a military family with a military spouse moving to Georgia, we move you to the front of the line, for your business license or your occupational license, professional license. So that's really important. And then we've also shown that we have fair and honest elections. So we'll continue to do those. Those are great Republican principles. I think those really are just great, great values to give every Georgian. They have the opportunity to get the professional license, to get the, to be able to vote. We think those are just things that transcend politics. It just happens that conservative Republican is leading the charge on that in Georgia. And that's a good thing, because I believe in Republican principles.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions coming in too about media scrutiny. Can you talk a little bit about the media scrutiny of the past couple of years and how that may have changed you as a person? You may never have thought you would face so much national or international attention. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I read a lot of history books. I understand back in 1770, 1780, they would dog cuss each other from both political parties. So it's something that is not new to this world. But I do think that people need to understand that if they do have biases, they need to really leave that at the door and just write fair articles or go to the editorial pages. Don't let your slant influence things. I think that's one thing that everyone sees. But it is what it is. And, you just deal with it and you move on.
Did the attention change you though, as a leader, or did it harden you, soften you, change your mind on anything, just being in the spotlight so intensely over the past couple of years?
No, I'm at a point in my life. I think the Lord's changed me. He's annealed my heart. And I understand that sometimes, people, were clamoring for a king, and it never worked out too well for Israel, And so in the day of the judges, in Judges 7:7, Gideon only had 300 men. So in my race, I'm looking for 300 people to come alongside me in a big way. And I think there's a big groundswell of other, conservatives that are looking for a good, honest, decent human being that'll do their job.
There's another question coming in from Mark Lind. Did you ever think that as Secretary of State, you would be harassed and have to have more security to be aware of your own safety?
No, whenever I always talk to folks, I always understand that I'm down ballot, but this 2020 cycle just, elevated the position of Secretary of State across the country. I also write about that in my book, is that when we went, my staff, we went up to Washington, D.C., and we were talking to some of these conservative groups saying, folks, we're just getting swamped with all these lawsuits from the left. And they basically said, well, we feel your pain, but we don't have any money for it. And I think that Republicans didn't understand how important and how significant who the Secretary of State is and what these laws are and how important it is. So for me to ban ballot harvesting was good. To me, to make sure that we got, be able to join ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information Center, so we could update our voter rolls. All the things and improvements that we made in Georgia have been really significant. I think now more Republicans are looking at that. But the answer isn't to find some shill that won't stand on the truth. You're looking for someone that's a principled conservative.
And back to your book, there's a question about, will you write another book?
One was plenty. It would be on a different topic, but I don't know what that would be right now. Right now, I'm pretty busy with the office and also with the re-election campaign.
Great. Nicole and Mark, back to you if you have any additional questions for the Secretary. And the audience, we're running out of time, so if you want to get your questions in, please send those now.
I don't want to ignore an audience question about something that I wrote about election security and whether our voting machines are vulnerable to potential tampering. There is an ongoing case about this. You have addressed it in that case to some extent. But do you think there are legitimate risks to our voting system, or do you think it's not such a big risk of somebody being able to somehow insert malware onto touchscreens and somehow find a way to change votes?
Well, you're talking about the Haldeman report, and Haldeman was given actually the security codes. So he had total access of the equipment, and he had it for 12 weeks. And then he comes back with his report and says, well, if you had that kind of access, then you could change things. Well, yeah. And just like the guy that's going to come in and work on your security system for your house, you give him all the access codes. Yeah, I guess he could come back maybe at 2 a.m. And so you don't have that kind of access. But people need to understand that the poll pad during election day is not connected to the internet. During early voting, the poll pad does have Wi-Fi capability. So if you voted precinct 1 in the morning, you can't vote in precinct 4 in the afternoon. So that's the only reason. It's encrypted Wi-Fi. The ballot marking device is just a ballot marking device to print out a ballot. And then the scanner on the back has 2 flash drives and a scanner. It's not connected to the internet. And nothing is connected to the internet. At the end of the day, on election day, you press the button, you tabulate, it prints out a piece of paper. The piece of paper and the 2 flash drives are what goes with 2 election workers and a deputy to the county headquarters, and that's where it's all put together. So nothing's connected to the internet. But Mark, here's the point about all that. When you print out the ballot, let's say you voted for candidate A, and all of a sudden it says candidate B. Well, then you're going to say something happened. You go back to the election worker and said, hey, it got the wrong person here. I don't know what happened. And then you didn't recognize that discrepancy. It didn't happen because in the 2020 election, we did a 100% hand recount. But here's what's going on, just so you understand. Judge Totenberg, Stacey Abrams, and President Trump all want hand-marked paper ballots. And I believe that the ballot marking device takes away that opportunity of questioning or asking, what exactly did that person mark on that ballot? Because if you look at what happens with the absentee ballot process, look at how people fill in the bubbles or don't fill in the bubbles, how they circle things, the X things, and all that. And that's where you end up with questions. And those are the kind of questions that end up being litigated after an election. What I'm trying to do is avoid lawsuits and trying to avoid voter intent. When you press all your selections on the ballot marking device and it prints it out, we know what your selections were. And so we don't get into that. We avoid lawsuits. So I think that we made the right choice. The General Assembly was right when they selected, a ballot marking device machine. I think that Mr. Haldeman, Dr. Haldeman, is way off base. When you have 12 weeks to look for stuff, I'm sure that anyone has that kind of unlimited access could do something, but it's not real world.
What impact would that have on the adjudication process? Because we did a lot of explaining about the bipartisan panel that goes through those ballots that are in question, and maybe there was a marking outside of a bubble or something, and they come to a consensus and move that ballot on for the final count. Does that change anything with the current process? Well,
if you actually went with hand-marked paper ballots, that means that a lot more ballots, because it won't be just the early vote ballots, which represent 6 to 10% of all the ballots, means the other 90% now will have more adjudication in those things. So you'll have 2 people, bipartisan review panels, arguing, and then that's where it'll go then to courts and arguing about this, and let's throw this out. And you're going to end up with disenfranchisement of voters. And I don't support that at all. Ballot marking device, you know exactly who that is.
Sure. You know, back to SB 202, there's this one part of it doesn't allow people to cast out of precinct provisional ballots. If you show up at the wrong precinct, election workers will tell you you have to go to your home precinct or else your vote won't count unless it's in the last 2 hours before polls close. Do you think that will cause a hindrance to voters? Do you think that will result in them not having their votes counted?
No, I think it's actually a better process. And the General Assembly is very moderate in their modification. They say after 5 o'clock, then you can vote out of precinct. But what was happening, it was actually becoming a political strategy. Just go anywhere and vote. But in effect, what you're telling voters is that you're disenfranchising you when you went to another precinct, that all those other ballots that were not at that precinct level, they wouldn't count. Top of the ticket would. And the campaigns that were doing that all it cared about was the top of the ticket. And so this way you don't disenfranchise voters of all the other races that are out there. But also you'd end up with a big line over at this one precinct because they're not supposed to be voting there. So when people go to their precinct, then the counties can manage that because they know how many voters they expect, how many machines we need. So the process just works a whole lot better. And that's the purpose of what we did. And so that's something that's been in place with no out of precinct voting in both Florida and Arizona. We modified it and moderated it so that after 5 o'clock, you can vote out of precinct.
Does that underline especially the importance of training in the county election offices too? Because I know with some of those elections investigations, people are saying, well, I was instructed to do this or that or go here or there with the provisional process. I only did what I was told.
Right.
That lends itself to.
Well, that gets back to training. And I've seen a lot of problems in some of the larger counties, predominantly Fulton County. It gets back to training. And the challenge you have is that we have to really have poll workers come back and work several elections. If it's your first election right out of the chute, there's an awful lot to learn there. So it does take an awful lot of training to have experienced poll managers to make sure that they're getting it right. And so counties, like Fulton County, they need a total top-down reorganization. Starts at the top, building a strong team, then the next level so that they can run their elections. But it does get back to poll worker training, but also voters need to look at, you have your registration card. It tells you what precinct you vote at, where are you going to go? Is it to a fire station? Is it to a library? Where exactly? And that's where you need to show up at.
We have another board member's question in here from Ken Foskett asking, some conservative media has attacked is this ERIC or air verification system that Georgia and many states belong to and have advocated that states abandon it. We wanted your thoughts on that.
Well, one of my conservative Secretary of State, fellow conservative Secretary of State from Alabama, John Merrill, pushed back big time about that allegation because he said it's allowed them to clean up the voter roll. We're actually getting better data because right now, because we're part of ERIC, if you move to any of the southeastern states except Tennessee, who's not joined, but 31 states, if you move away from Georgia and move to, say, Texas, North Carolina, or Florida, and register there, we'll get notification. We can start taking you off the voter rolls. Likewise, if you move from Texas and move to Georgia, we tell Texas that this person has come here registered. Texas can keep their voter rolls. We get better death records. We can really keep our voter rolls updated. If you don't have that, you're going to have dirty lists. And so the conspiracy theory, and this has not been funded by any outside organizations. We had a grant program before we were a member from Pew that got it started. But now the states are paying the full funding of ERIC and it's doing an excellent job. We have better voter roll and better list maintenance because of it.
Very good. Very good. Well, I think that's great. Christy, would you like to take over? Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. Those are great answers.
Thank you so much to Secretary Raffensperger and of course to Nicole Carr from ProPublica and Mark Niesse from the AJC. It's been a great discussion today. We appreciate your time. Thanks for everybody who joined us this morning. You can visit atlantapressclub.org to see our upcoming events, and this event will be posted in its entirety online later today. Thanks everybody for joining us. Glad to have you.